Thank you, Mr. Williams. You've been very clear about your thoughts on capital gains. You didn't address directly, though I might be able to surmise your thoughts on the true-up mechanism in the governor's proposal as it's been roughly described to us.
My view on a true-up is a true-up may work in a different context, like if you have a tax change and you want to maintain revenue neutrality or something like that. Here, I think a true-up is sort of problematic. I think that you could get in a situation where I think Jason sort of described it. It's the very same one, where let's say you did underestimate capital gains. And so you ended up committing the funds to programs when, if you knew the right amount of capital gains, you would have ended up putting it in a reserve. You find out about it a year later.
Or 2 years later.
2 years later, yes. You are in a position now where you've committed funds that you're going to have to pull back out of those programs. And if you are in a situation where you now have a downturn, you've kind of got a double whammy. You've not set aside the money you needed to set aside, but now you also, not only do you have to cut the program because of the downturn, but you also have to go back and cut the program again because of a true-up.
And potentially a constitutional requirement to get that money into the
If it's in the Constitution, that would certainly be the case.
Now, could you write into it some safety valves of sorts?
In a true-up mechanism?
Or in the requirements of the budget reserve itself, that if it is to be dependent upon capital gains, and given that we have this lag time in determining accurate capital gains, and we'll have to go through a true-up, that if in case of the situation you just described, we could have some exit.
Yeah, you could have an exemption for if the true-up adjustment comes in the same year as you have a downturn. One could have.
But it gets a little more complex.
You could keep writing provisions.
And then,
yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Before we go to Dr. Rubin, can you offer any additional wisdom as to this tension that we described and spoke with Mr. Gage about, with regard to our very low level of funding, if only for purposes of this conversation, relative to per pupil spending, the need to build a reserve, but at a very low level of spending on education, and then having the potentiality of making the case to voters that we need to sustain tax levels at Prop 30 level?
Well, obviously a big challenge. Yeah. I mean, no question, and huge tension. I mean, this is kind of the problem, though, that I think members have faced for a number of years. Following the early 90s recession and the second half of the 90s, I think there was a lot of demand to restore programs, and there was the tension between the reserve and the programs won. By and large, it wasn't just programs; it was also tax cuts. But let's just say commitments, whether it be on the revenue side or the expenditure side, won out. So you kind of have that. We know what happened, right? I mean, it was we had the massive downturn, and we didn't have any reserves to protect ourselves. I kind of feel the same way. I feel like in California there is sort of a different culture. I think it goes all the way back to Proposition 13 when we had a huge surplus and the voters came along and passed Prop 13, and the surplus was certainly part of that debate. It does seem harder in California to build reserves or make a case to build a reserve. Yet we know, I'm sure you know how. What seems like a massive reserve that may have, if we ever get there, could have been accumulated over a number of years. Modest things
could go in a flash.
Could go in a second. And I guess the other point about a big reserve that may be a difficult point to make to voters, but the fact that you have a big reserve doesn't mean that, let's say it's $10 billion, it doesn't mean you could turn around and start spending $10 billion on schools or anything else. Because, obviously that might have been built over many, many years, and if you spend it all in the first year, you're going to be short the next year anyway, unless you have a situation where revenues are so far above expenditures.
And the governor's proposal has limitations as to how much you could withdraw in any 1 year.
Yeah, yes. So it's a tough, I think it's a tough sell, but on the other side of it is absent healthy reserves, going to have the same kind of challenges that you've had in the past. Hopefully not as bad as the Great Recession, but I think we do have an economy and a revenue structure where the recent past is more representative. I don't think it will be as bad, but recessions and recoveries may look more like the recent past than the more distant past, when they tended to be, as Tim said, V-shaped, short and sweet, and you moved on. And so in that kind of world, it's large reserves are one of your few sources of protection.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Dr. Rubin, you get the last word.
Okay, that's exciting. And I'm excited to be here with the California folk rather than with the DC folk. I'm Kim Rubin. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, and I'm also an affiliated scholar at the Public Policy Institute of California. So in my heart, I still consider myself a Californian, even though I'm in DC. We've covered a lot of issues this afternoon that have to do with California. I'm going to try and be brief and discuss what we know from academic literature, and then also provide some information about sort of difficulties in implementing ACA 4 or the governor's budget, and also come up with a different proposal that may or may not be laughed at by Brad, which we've already been debated. So first, can we actually learn anything from what public finance economists do? And I'm going to argue yes, although it's hard because, as was covered in the last session, if you have rainy day funds in 40 states, you have 40 different rainy day funds. But in general, we find from the research that there actually is a positive effect of having a rainy day fund in place, and that fiscal institutions can actually make a difference. Now, I have colleagues of mine at the Urban Institute actually found in the prior recession that spending cuts were 20% less in states that had a reasonable rainy day fund than in states that didn't. So they were actually able to maintain spending for longer. Some of the information that was presented from Jonathan, I think, masks the fact that California has a really big effect on what rainy day funds nationally look like, or what spending deficits look like, because it's such a big state. But I do think some of the states like Massachusetts, actually were able to respond better to recessions because they had some money saved up. We also find that in work I did with Jim Peterba, we found that ratings agencies actually respond positively to states that have a rainy day fund, and it actually is a stringent rainy day fund. So it actually takes more than just a legislative majority to access it. So there is some positive evidence that you can save some money on your borrowing costs if you actually are showing some level of fiscal restraint. Finally, Shadow Rose has found that with rainy day funds, she actually found that independent of how big the problems were, legislators or states actually spent more of their money from rainy day funds in election years than not in election years, where she found that for a given size of a deficit or a problem, they were spending somewhere between 3 and 4 times as much if it was during an election year. So that would argue in some ways that maybe if you want to keep it out of the politics, which I think makes perfect sense, if you think people are trying to address problems if they think there's going to be a big reaction, to have something that might be a little bit more automatic. Now, these are sort of general rules and general results across 50 states. California is in a much harder position than many other states because any rainy day fund you have is going to interact with other institutions that are in place. One, revenues are really volatile in part because of Proposition 13 and the fact that property taxes are lower than on average in other states. So you're more reliant on an income tax that happens to be pretty progressive, I actually think that's appropriate given the fact of what incomes look like in California, the fact that you have kind of a bivariate distribution of populations where you have a fair number of poor people and a fair number of wealthier people, and it's a large state. I think having some progressivity in your income tax makes a lot of sense, and I don't think you're seeing people moving out necessarily, although I have colleagues that might disagree with that approach. So I feel like, in some ways, what I'd like to propose is, and then there's Prop 98, where basically if you have money in your general fund, a certain amount of it has to go to education spending, right? This is in the Constitution, it's a law. And so as opposed to thinking about setting up a rainy day fund within Prop 98, which I think is going to be hard to sustain, I'm not sure I totally believe that school districts, if they're seeing problems in their spending levels and they want to increase spending levels, aren't necessarily going to argue against the fact that part of the Prop 98 guarantee is in this money that they can't touch and is sitting at the state level. I'm actually going to bring up something different, and it's based on capital gains, but I would also almost base it on capital gains and stock options and parts of the budget that might be hard to predict, but that also tend to be more volatile. I would almost want that money to be cordoned off and averaged over time, right? In some ways, rather than putting that money in a rainy day fund, I would almost want there to be something where you take 1/5 of a 5-year average of what stock options look like, or stock options and capital gains, and put that into the general fund, which would then be part of the Prop 98 trigger and all the other funding things. Now, for something like that to work right now, you need to start it in a year when you have pretty high capital gains, right? So this year, or using last year's numbers, would actually help, because for the first year, you want any year you start something new to end up with a surplus, because there's no way you're going to say, okay, we're going to average our capital gains money and we need to find $2 billion from somewhere else to include in our spending. But looking at the numbers that Brad presented, I found that you could get rid of 1/3 of the capital gains volatility if you did something like this starting in 1995. Going forward, and you would end up with a positive balance that got up to something as large as $12 billion, but then went down after you hit periods when the economy sort of, the bottom fell out. You could also do something where you don't necessarily need to use this year's capital gains. You could use an average that's lagged a year, so you don't have as much of the uncertainty in the process. Another reason, I'd love to see something like that, which is sort of smoothing a volatile revenue source in addition to keeping something like Prop 58, where you actually still keep a rainy day fund and a stabilization fund. Because I see them as maybe serving different roles, but it also would be a way of taking what is more and more volatile revenues and trying not to have it hit your spending programs that often increase every year. And part of this is having lived through being in California during that period in the 1990s. It was really hard to watch when suddenly the amount of money that was expected to be spent on certain things wasn't available, and you also had something like the car tax cut. So that you got rid, so as stable tax source was cut because there was this volatile taxes coming in, and so avoiding that going forward would be really important. I'd also argue that it's really important right now to try and figure out some way of getting money into a stabilization fund or doing something. I feel like the timing is really good right now, in part because I feel like a lot of what we've seen in capital gains is actually coming from uncertainty and reactions to what's going on at the federal level. So part of this is also where I sit now in DC. I feel like we saw a lot of capital gains realizations because of gimmicks that the federal government is doing. I think because we didn't know whether capital gains rates were going up in both 2010 and 2012, We saw a lot of realizations. We also saw people getting their stock options earlier than they normally do. They normally get it in the next year, but there were a lot of realizations and stock options being given to people in the prior year in December to avoid any increases in federal tax rates. And so I think those numbers are high right now. And so I don't think we're going to see the same level of capital gains going forward in the next few years, because I think part of what we saw in the last couple of years has to do with the fact that I feel like people were playing games with their shifting of when they realized their capital gains. So it would make me really nervous to have a lot of that built into your base level, just because I think part of it might be coming from federal actions that we're hoping are kind of resolved at this point.
Would the Federal Reserve's wind down of its current purchasing program also exacerbate that situation?
So that might, although that's basically taking some money out, so I think it probably could have an effect, although part of the problem, and I think part of the reason the Federal Reserve is winding it down, is there's some uncertainty about whether businesses are actually responding in the way that we're hoping they would respond in terms of expanding rather than just sitting on funds. So there actually is a fair amount of savings. We actually have higher national savings right now than in other years, but a lot of that is actually coming from declines in the federal deficit and the fact that there are a lot of businesses sitting on reserves. So I think that we would see some of that. I feel like there were a lot of realizations. There were also games being played where, right, I'm not in DC, I can call it games at this point, with
You're among friends.
having people, realize gains from Roth IRAs and transfer them into tax-deferred money, which was done so that in the short time period, Congress could say that they were doing things that were budget neutral, but in the end are going to cost the federal government a lot of money, but also led to people having a lot of realizations and having income taxes for states go up, because people suddenly had taxable income that wasn't real income. It was basically this retirement income that they were trying to put into a tax-free place because of what the federal government was doing. So that's just some argument for why right now, if there's more money around, I would want some of that saved rather than put into anything that was continuing, even though there are big problems in terms of programs that were cut, because I'm just nervous about how long that money is going to be there. All right, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. And you had mentioned, I think I heard you correctly, that you thought formulaic had its advantages because we're all such political animals. And I don't say that
and I don't know if it's
in a negative way.
California.
That's not in a bad way.
I think having some formulas. So part of the reason I like doing something like taking capital gains and smoothing it and having it put it in a formulaic way while still having something that looks like a 5% or a 3% budget stabilization fund actually gives you a little more discretion. I also would probably argue that I would be nervous with statutory budget stabilization funds, and that I'm not sure how it will interact with the rules that are currently in the Constitution, most notably Prop 98. If you have the Prop 98 guarantee and you have a budget stabilization set up here, and there's some argument that you're taking away some of that money, I feel like there's some benefit to being in the Constitution in terms of
as Ms. Bosler described it to us, it's after the Prop 98 set aside.
Except some of that money is then going into a Prop 98 rainy day fund. Right? I feel like, in my mind,
That was a secondary aspect.
I want to get some of the volatility out of the education budget, just because I think it makes it that much harder. I think it makes it that much harder for school districts to handle. I think it makes it harder to interact if you're making long-term commitments to your teachers. And so I feel like having a steadier and more reliable funding source for things that seem like they are ongoing, very predictable expenses is important. And I feel like we lose that when we start having some of these other more volatile revenue sources in the year to year.
Questions, colleagues? Senator Anderson has one.
I just want to be clear. So your question about it is more about the cash flow and the regular and the amount being smooth and consistent. It's not about actually protecting the rainy day fund and being unclear in the law. So it's. I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly.
That's right. I would like more volatile revenue sources to somehow be smoothed before they even touch the general fund, just because of the propositions and the rules that are in place in California makes your job so difficult in trying to figure out how you budget. The last year I lived here was the year where there were 2 stabilization funds on the ballot, and if they had passed, they would have managed to make you, contribute more money than any increases in revenues. And so I feel like California is especially difficult because of all the rules that are already in the Constitution, but I don't know whether that makes it more necessary to put other things into the Constitution.
Thank you for your clarity. No, it's very complex. It's not a criticism. Any other questions? Mr. Gage, Dr. Rubin, Mr. Williams, thank you very much for giving us your time and expertise.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do we have anyone who'd like to extend this hearing by speaking at public comment? If so, please step forward.
Yeah, well, I'll offer an apology first. Fred Silva with California Forward, a fiscal policy advisor to California Forward.
Always good to see you.
We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization concerned with governance and fiscal policy. You have testimony that I've submitted.
Thank you.
We had 2 basic views. One of them is having some kind of a marker for you to use in order to determine how to handle the volatility problem is a big issue, ought to go in the Constitution. Our basic fiscal rules are in there. They started back in 1924. We've been putting them in ever since. It's important then to distinguish between the constitutional provisions and the provisions that ought to be in statute that provide flexibility. So we've found in all of our civic engagement work that people are actually interested in dealing with this issue. So the extent to which we can be helpful in that regard, the California Forward can make those contributions that would be helpful to you, we would be glad to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Silva.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you for your work at California Forward.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Public comment? Going once, twice. Thank you all for joining us today. We've heard a lot. We've learned a lot. We look forward to the imminent receipt of the governor's language on the reserve proposal. And I'm sure this is just the beginning of our conversation as we enter into our budget subcommittee season starting in a few weeks, and then the reconvening of the full budget committee in the month of May as we approach our June 15th budget passage. We are adjourned.